Welcome to our next session here at Keswick Convention, where we're looking at the topic, Let There Be Light, Hope in Our Secular World. So the session today is called The Light of the Stars Proclaim His Glory. I love the stars. I remember so clearly my wife and I were in a rural town, staying on a farm out of town, and we'd come back in fairly late evening after a meeting. It was a moonless night, no clouds, and the stars were just breathtaking. We stood there in awe, gazing at them. We couldn't stand for too long, it was only 3 degrees, but it was just fantastic to see. You have to remember, I live in Sydney, and you just don't see the stars like that in a large city. You know, how is God's glory proclaimed in the stars? Well, firstly, when we acknowledge that He is the creator of the universe. King David wrote these words, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place." You see, he declared God was the creator of the heavens. And he goes on and says, "What is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him." You see, David was awestruck by the majesty of the stars and of the heavens, and then awestruck by the reality that God actually cares about each and every one of us. You know, we are so blessed that God, in His grace and mercy, has given us His Word. And His Word, the Bible, is the only way that we have any knowledge about our origins. We can't go back to observe them, as we have discussed, but God is the eyewitness of all that He did. The God who doesn't lie has told us all we need to know about our origins. And in those opening chapters, we discover that God created everything in the entire universe in just 6 normal length days, just like the days we experience now. And most importantly, from the chronogenealogies in Genesis 5, 7 and 9, we can discover that Abraham was born about 2,000 years after the creation. And that from Abraham through to King David, and then via the line of Mary and the line of Joseph, all the way to the time of Jesus, is about another 2,000 years. Of course, from the time of Jesus to the present day is about 2,000 years. So, according to the Bible, not my idea, here we stand today about 6,000 years after the creation. Now that is an amazing statement, isn't it? Amazing in our culture, because we are so indoctrinated with this secular story of our origins called the Big Bang. Now remember that the evolutionary or Big Bang story begins with the assumption there is no God. So we are forced with that assumption to find only naturalistic explanations for everything. And so the naturalistic explanation for the existence of the universe involves deep time, billions and billions of years, random, unguided processes. So that from this putative quantum fluctuation right at the beginning, some 14 or so billion years ago, to the present day, where we have found on Earth this double helix molecule, as you can see there in the lower right-hand side, with all the instructions contained therein to make every living organism, that all of that just happened by chance in an unguided way. You see, to invoke any guide immediately invokes a divine creator. Here is another way in which that Big Bang story is depicted. On the left, we have the quantum fluctuation, followed by this incredible period of inflation, as it's called, which begins for no reason, it ends for no reason, and during it, special physics happens. Matter repels matter rather than attracting it through the force of gravity. And thereafter, there's been this gradual, slowly accelerating expansion of the universe, and apparently about 4.5 billion years ago, our solar system was formed. You see, when scientists begin with the assumption there's no God and are therefore constrained to naturalistic explanations of everything, we end up with this kind of a picture. But the Big Bang story has some enormous problems. One of which is that it is extraordinarily well and finely tuned. And let me explain it like this. The force of the Big Bang had to precisely balance the force of gravity for the universe to even exist. These two forces had to be balanced to within 1 part in 10 to the 60th. Now that's kind of incomprehensible. It's the number 1 with 60 zeros following it. Now friends, every time you add a 0, you make the number 10 times bigger than it was before. So 10 to the 60th is incomprehensible. But let me try and explain it like this. Scientists believe there are approximately 10 to the 80th atoms in the entire known universe. So I hope you get the idea. This is a big number. There are approximately 10 to the 20th atoms in a grain of sand. So if we could think of the whole universe as just grains of sand, there would be about 10 to the 60th grains of sand. Now, the Big Bang is so finely tuned that if there was just 1 grain of sand too many, then the force of gravity would win and the universe would have collapsed into a big crunch, never forming galaxies and stars and us. But if there was 1 grain too few, there would be insufficient mass in the universe and it would fly apart and never form galaxies and stars and us. This scientist summed it up very well. To put this in perspective, about 1 grain of sand would have unbalanced the Big Bang, causing it to either recollapse into a black hole or to expand so fast as to never form stars and galaxies. 1 grain of sand more, 1 grain less, and we would not be here. Can you imagine that? That is fantastically unlikely. And that's the issue of fine-tuning in the Big Bang. Now, sadly, some apologists use the fine-tuning of the Big Bang as an argument for the existence of God. But this is very weak because the text of Genesis does not allow for the Big Bang. And let me explain. Here we've shown on this chart the sequence of events. On the right-hand side, the Big Bang. The left-hand side is as outlined in the book of Genesis and the events of the first 6 days. But these sequences are completely irreconcilable. For instance, the Big Bang has the sun formed first and then the earth, but Genesis says that the earth formed first and the sun was made on the 4th day of creation. The Big Bang says that the earth was a molten, brilliant mass at the beginning which cooled down. Genesis says that the earth began cool and dark right at the beginning. The Big Bang requires billions of years. But the Genesis account says that God did it all through the might of his spoken word in just 6 days. The Big Bang, of course, places death and suffering for millions of years before mankind. The Bible tells us that it was Adam's actions in the garden, his act of rebellion, that brought death and suffering into the world. You see, these things are completely irreconcilable, and those little flashes shown there on the chart represent a conflict in the two schemes. But you know, the Big Bang struggles with a whole bunch of other things too. For instance, the universe should not actually exist. When energy converts into matter through that classic famous equation of Einstein's E equals mc squared, there should be equal amounts of matter and antimatter. But matter and antimatter mutually annihilate each other, so why is there any matter at all? We should not even be here. Now, this is a major problem, and scientists have done a lot of very careful and precise experiments to try to discover if there has to have been a small imbalance, like just 1 proton of matter in 1 billion protons and antiprotons required to produce that imbalance to lead to you and me. But the best experiments that we can possibly do today reveal no such imbalance. Let me quote the scientist here who said, "All of our observations find a complete symmetry between matter and antimatter, which is why the universe should not actually exist." But that's not all that the secularist struggles with. For instance, the question, did the universe have a beginning? Sounds simple enough, but there's a dilemma here. If yes, then something must, in fact everything, must have come from nothing. But the first law of thermodynamics, which is observable, tells us that the total amount of matter and energy which exists can never change. You can convert matter into energy via the Einsteinian equation, but the sum total is invariant. So the idea of the universe having a beginning violates the first law of thermodynamics. Nothing became everything. But if the answer, did the universe have a beginning, is no, then this violates the second law of thermodynamics, which says that naturally occurring processes will always lead to a universal increase in disorder, or entropy as it's called. And energy is dissipated ultimately as heat. In fact, the universe is going to die a heat death. Now, the universe is running down right now. That's an observable phenomenon, but it has not yet run down, so therefore it must have had a beginning. So here's the dilemma. The first law says that the universe cannot have had a beginning, therefore it must be eternal. The second law says the universe cannot be eternal, therefore it must have had a beginning. And there's no way out except to recognise that there was a divine creator who is outside of the space-time matter universe and by the word of his power spoke it into being. You know, the problems surrounding the Big Bang and the secularist attempts at explaining our universe are so vast that Jacques Lasauer, one of the world's leading planetary scientists, said this: "The origin of the solar system is one of the most fundamental problems of science. Together with the origin of the universe, galaxy formation, the origin and evolution of life, it forms a crucial piece in understanding where we as a species come from." But let's think about that. There's not a lot left, is there? You see, everything is a problem to explain when you do away with God at the outset. I think Professor Paul Davies summed it up extremely well when he said, "The Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. It represents a true miracle." But friends, when we look at God's Word, we understand the origin of the universe, don't we? Because right at the beginning it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So let's take a little bit of a look now at our moon. And I love this photograph. It is not a collage, it's an actual photograph taken by the Galileo spacecraft, 6 million kilometres from the Earth. So where did the moon come from? Well, the secularists have to try and account for the origin of the moon, and there have been a number of attempts to do so. One of them was called the fission theory, and George Darwin, Charles Darwin's son, came up with this idea that the molten Earth spun so quickly that the moon was flung off while it was still molten, and then they both condensed out and formed our present sun and moon. But there are a lot of problems with this, one of which is that the moon is too chemically different from the Earth. It's not identical, so that doesn't work. The moon should be in the Earth's equatorial plane if this occurred. The plane of the moon's orbit is inclined at about 5 degrees to the Earth's equatorial plane. And by the way, the Earth could not have spun fast enough and survived. So the fission theory, as it's called, is now largely discounted. And then there was the capture theory, the idea that the moon was wandering in the solar system and was accidentally captured by the Earth. Now, I spent many years working in the aerospace industry. I was involved in the design of communications spacecraft. And they have a special orbit, the geostationary ones do, that is directly above the Earth's equator and at just the right distance, so it takes the same time to go once in orbit around the Earth as it takes the Earth to rotate. What that means is that from our vantage point here on the Earth, the satellites appear to be fixed in the sky. That's why we can use such simple antennas that don't have to have tracking motors on them and so on. So to place a communication satellite in a geostationary orbit requires a sequence of carefully planned and engineered manoeuvres. It doesn't just happen by chance. So the chance of the moon just wandering into our solar system and inadvertently being caught in an orbit around the Earth that's almost perfectly circular are staggeringly unlikely. And also, the geophysical similarities between the Earth and the moon are too great for the moon to have just appeared from somewhere else. So the capture theory is now not really held in much credence. And then there's the accretion or co-creation theory, the idea that the Earth and moon formed from the same part of the swirling cloud of dust and gas that apparently is supposed to have formed our solar system, even though the mechanisms are not understood. But this idea doesn't account for the fact that the moon has a fairly low iron content, the element iron. The moon, once again, should be in the Earth's equatorial plane, but the plane of its orbit is tilted. And by the way, the Earth and the moon have far too much angular momentum for it to have formed from a swirling cloud of dust and gas. So the accretion or co-creation theory also is not accepted today. You know, one of the motivations for launching the Apollo missions back in the 60s was to see which of these three theories, if any, was actually right about the origin of the moon. When they brought back the moon rock samples, then they're essentially able to dismiss all three of them. So the current and most popular view today is called the giant impact hypothesis. And a Mars-sized object called Theia apparently impacted the proto-Earth while it was still molten, and the ejector formed the moon, and the Earth recovered, and now we have our Earth-Moon system. But there are many problems with this too. Once again, geochemical support is lacking. The moon and Earth are actually too similar because the moon should consist mostly of Theia's material, not the Earth. Why is there only one moon, for instance? The modelling shows there should have been multiple ones formed by that. And there are many others. But you know, the most favoured reason for adopting the giant impact hypothesis is because all the other models fail. So the reality is that the giant impact hypothesis is not a good explanation for the origin of the moon at all. In fact, the problem is so great that a very famous astronomer, Professor Erwin Shapiro, said in a joking moment, "Since there are no good explanations, the best explanation is that the moon is an illusion." But friends, if we go to God's word, the answer's clear, isn't it? God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. It was God's divine act of creative genius that made the Earth-Moon system. And friends, it is genius because the moon serves a vital purpose for life on Earth. Do you know that the moon is the primary cause of our tides, ocean tides, which flushes the coastal waters and ensures the water is oxygenated so that life can thrive. Otherwise, the coastal areas would become stagnant and unsuitable for life. Now, if the moon was too close to us or too massive, then the tides would be very destructive onto the coastlines all around the Earth, twice daily. If the moon was too far away or if its mass was too small, there would be insufficient tidal action for coastal life to thrive. You see, tides are actually evidence of brilliant design, but design points to a designer. So let's take a closer look at the moon. Now, I've always wondered, why do we see only one face of the moon? When I was younger, I thought, how could it be that the spin rate of the moon on its axis was exactly matched to the time it took to go once around the Earth, so that only one face always faced the Earth? It was much later that I came to realise that the moon is actually tidally locked to the Earth. And what that means is that the gravitational field that the Earth exerts on the moon causes it to actually be stretched a little, so that instead of being a perfect sphere, the moon is like a football. It's what you could call an oblate spheroid. So if the moon tries to turn away, then there's a resultant torque which actually turns it back. So the moon is held in this position as it orbits the Earth. Now, fascinatingly enough, that process also works back on the Earth. Now here we have the Earth spinning, but it's in a gravitational gradient caused by the Moon. And what that means is that as the Earth spins, there's a resultant braking action that tends to continually slow it down. Now this slowing down of the Earth's spin rate is really quite fascinating. You see, back in about 1955, scientists introduced an atomic time standard. Up until then, standard time was what was called mean solar time, the average time at which the sun crossed the meridian of a particular location. Atomic time is determined instead by the ground state transition frequency in a cesium atom. Consequently, there is now the prospect of atomic time drifting away from mean solar time. So scientists expected that every now and again they would have to add or subtract what was called a leap second to keep the two time scales locked together. Now, it was believed that this would be a random process. Sometimes they would be added and sometimes they would be subtracted. But interestingly, since leap seconds began in 1972, they have only ever been added. And in fact, there have been something like 27 added leap seconds. Now, the length of a day on the Earth is steadily increasing at an average rate of about 1.6 milliseconds every single day. And you can see in this chart that there are some fairly rapid annular variations which are caused by the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit, and some long period, decade-long variations that are believed to be due to geological mechanisms like ocean resonances or core mantle interactions. But when we take a look at these leap seconds, we find that there's a continual non-random slowing down or increasing of the length of a day on the Earth. It's not a random process at all. There are a number of factors that can influence the slowing down of the Earth's spin rate. And one of them is changing the moment of inertia of the Earth. Now, I'm sure you've all seen the skater with their arms stretched out, spinning around, and then as they pull their arms in, they spin much, much faster. That's because when their arms come in, they have reduced their moment of inertia, but angular momentum is always conserved, so they spin faster. So you can have geological phenomena which change the mass distribution of the Earth, therefore changing its moment of inertia and therefore the spin rate. For instance, the length of a day increased by 1.8 microseconds as a result of the magnitude 9 earthquake in 2011 that occurred in Japan and caused the Japanese tsunami. Now, all we have is 55 years of accurate length of day measurements. But has this slowing down of the Earth's rotation been continuing all the way back into the past? Well, we can get an interesting little glimpse by looking at ancient eclipse records. So let me talk a moment about eclipses. Now, although it is 400 times larger, the Sun is 400 times further away from us than the Moon. That means the Sun and the Moon appear to be the same size. So at just the right times, when the orbits permit, the Sun, Moon and Earth can precisely align, and that produces a total solar eclipse. Now, the size of the totality is actually quite small. It's a little blob of shadow, only about 200 kilometres in diameter. And here's an amazing photograph showing a total solar eclipse with the shadow of the Moon passing over Mexico. Now, the geometry of the Earth, Sun and the Moon determine the path of that little shadow line as it traces across the Earth during a total solar eclipse. And the records show that in the year 360 BC, there was a total solar eclipse in Babylon. Now, if the Earth's rotation rate had been constant at the same rate that it is today, the eclipse would have missed Babylon. So there would be no record of an eclipse there at all. But if the Earth was spinning a little faster back then you can make it work. In fact, there would have been accumulated some 16,000 seconds or 4.5 hours of time difference. So ancient eclipse data indicates that the Earth's spin rate was indeed higher in the past, and it has been steadily slowing down at least over the last 2,700 years. So let's just summarise all of that. Leap seconds have only ever been added since 1972. The average increase in the length of day right now is about 1.6 milliseconds per day as measured via atomic time. Ancient eclipse records are consistent with a steadily increased length of day over the past 2,700 years. The problem is, though, that the measured rate of increase in the length of day is way too much for the Earth to be 4,500 million years old. But a decrease in the Earth's spin rate is consistent with the Bible's timescales of only thousands of years. Now, this process works back on the Earth as well. So as the Earth spins down, it transfers angular momentum to the Moon, which moves faster in its orbit, causing it to spiral outwards. Now, when the Apollo missions went to the Moon, they left a number of experiments on the surface of the Moon. And one of them was a group of passive corner reflectors. Now, corner reflectors are like the cat's eyes that you see on roadways. When your headlights shine onto the corner reflector, the light comes straight back to you, no matter what angle you are on. So scientists can transmit high-powered laser beams to the Moon. They strike the corner reflectors, come straight back again, and the scientists can measure the round trip time, from which we can deduce that the Moon is receding from us at the rate of about 3.8 centimetres every year. Doesn't sound like much, does it? But it's really interesting because if you wind the process backwards and let the Moon go as close as it possibly could to the Earth, which is called the Roche limit, the very maximum age for the Earth-Moon system is only 1,500 million years for that mechanism. But hang on a minute, that's too short, isn't it, for the evolutionary story, which says the solar system has to be about 4.5 billion years old, not just 1.5. Now, the secular scientists are alert to this and are perplexed. And this scientist wrote, "Dissipation of tidal energy causes the Moon to recede from the Earth. The currently measured rate of recession implies that the age of the lunar orbit is 1,500 million years old, but the Moon is known to be 4,500 million years old. Consequently, it can be argued that prolonged periods of weak tidal dissipation must have existed in the past." Now, friends, can you see what's happening here? He makes an observation which tells him that the Earth-Moon system can't really be older than 1.5 billion years. But that's too short from what he believes the age of the Earth-Moon system to be. So to fix the problem, he postulates some unobserved phenomenon, whatever it is, weak tidal dissipation must have existed to solve the problem. But friends, that's not science, that's simply propping up your a priori belief. So let's take a look at some examples in the solar system to see if the timescale is consistent with what the Bible says. Now, back in the 1990s, the Magellan spacecraft visited the planet Venus. Venus has a very thick, opaque atmosphere, so Magellan used radar to image the surface features, mountain ranges, and so on. Then about 16 years later, the Venus Express satellite was launched in 2005, and it picked up where Magellan had left off. However, it made a surprising discovery. The features that it was expecting to find turned up too late, which implied that Venus was spinning slower than what it was just 16 years earlier. And the scientists said, however, the surface features seen by Venus Express some 16 years later than Magellan could only be lined up with those observed by Magellan if the length of the Venus day is on average 6.5 minutes longer than Magellan measured. Wow, 6.5 minutes longer in just 16 years. Friends, that rate implies a maximum age of Venus of less than 1 million years, which is a disaster, of course, for the Big Bang story, but it is consistent with a recent creation. I love this example. The planet Jupiter is surrounded by many moons. 12 more were discovered a couple of years ago. But amazingly, these moons were orbiting Jupiter the wrong way. Now, the inner moons have what is called a prograde orbit. That is, they orbit Jupiter in the same direction that Jupiter is rotating. But these outer ones go the wrong way. Now, that, by the way, is a major challenge to solve for current theories about planetary formation. But setting that aside for the minute, in this group of retrograde moons, there was found a prograde moon called Valetudo. So this guy's like a kamikaze pilot because he's flying upstream. Just imagine you're driving along a freeway and then you decide that I'm going to cross over to the other side. How long do you think you're going to last? Well, not long at all. And as the scientist said, head-on collisions would quickly break apart and grind the objects down to dust. And in a lovely euphemism, they said, this is an unstable situation. But friends, the point is, the moons of Jupiter cannot be millions of years old, let alone billions, because of this situation. But it is consistent with the Bible's timescales. In our solar system, we observe short period comets, comets with a period less than typically 200 years. Now, every time a comet orbits the sun, it loses some mass. So that means that comets will disintegrate in anywhere from 10 to 100,000 years at the most. So if the solar system was in fact 4.5 billion years old, there should be no short period comets left anymore. So the mere fact that we observe short period comets is actually consistent with the Bible's timescales. Now, the secularists have an explanation, and they say, oh, well, it's like this. Here's our solar system out to the orbit of Neptune. And beyond that, we have what are called Kuiper belt objects. And these Kuiper belt objects contain the nuclei for short period comets, and they occasionally get disturbed. They fall into the sun in elliptical orbit, and that's the constant supply and source of short period comets. But what do the observations show? Well, Kuiper belt objects turn out to be too large to be short period comets. Some of them are as big as the moon. Short period comets are in fact quite small, only 1 kilometre or 2 maybe in diameter. But not only that, a very distinct lack of cratering on Pluto and Charon would suggest that there are very few, if any, small Kuiper belt objects out there sufficient to constantly feed the solar system with short period comets. You see, back in 2015, the New Horizons spacecraft flew past Pluto and Charon. And the first photographs of Charon were received in February 2019. And they showed a remarkable result. The surface showed a paucity of small craters. Yes, it had large ones, and that's consistent with what we observe, large Kuiper belt objects. But there should have been lots and lots of small craters, if there are indeed small Kuiper belt objects out there. Now, Charon is geologically inert, and so should actually provide a stable record of impacts. So there is no known source in the secular model now of short period comets. We had an article in our Creation magazine about this, Comet Conundrum it was called. Now, the secularists also believe there is a vast cloud called the Oort cloud that surrounds our solar system, and that is supposed to supply the long period comets. The Oort cloud, however, is undetectable, which, remember, science is about observations, right? Not storytelling. But the very existence of comets in our solar system is indeed consistent with the biblical timescales. You know, there are a number of blue stars in our Milky Way. If you look at the belt of Orion, the centre star there is called Alnilam, and it's a blue supergiant that is 275,000 times brighter than our sun. Now, based on its brilliance, it must be burning its thermonuclear fuel at a phenomenal rate, such that it could not last even 1 million years before running out of fuel. And yet there it is, burning brightly in the skies. Now, secular astronomers argue, oh, well, stars are being born all the time. But the problem is star formation is very problematic. Gases resist compression. Magnetic fields will disperse gases, and angular momentum conservation will actually prevent further collapse. You see, there is no viable or plausible model for star formation in the Big Bang Theory. But based on observations, we can see that there are short-lived blue stars out there. But friends, that is consistent with a recent creation. And there are globular clusters. These are collections of up to 1 million stars, like M13 in this illustration, which is a globular cluster that orbits our Milky Way galaxy. Globular clusters should not have any rotation in their centres. And as this scientist says, theory and numerical simulations of globular clusters indicate that any central rotation should be erased on a relatively short time scale. Because these globular clusters are formed billions of years ago, we would expect that any rotation signature would have been eradicated by now. Well, what do we observe? Well, when they do measurements on the centres of globular clusters, we find some stars are blue shifted and some are red shifted. Now, blue shift means that they're coming towards us. Red shift means they're going away. So that means there is measurable rotation happening within globular clusters. And the researchers said, in all clusters studied, the centres are rotating. This result is astonishing, team leader Fabricius says. We did not expect this. But, friends, this is consistent with a recent creation. You see, everywhere we look in this universe of ours, we find evidence that is consistent with the Bible's record of history, and that God is the creator of the heavens and the earth. Friends, there are so many wonderful resources that I would love to recommend to you. This book on the solar system is a collection of articles from past issues of Creation magazine, and I recommend it to you. If it's not available at the tables at the back, you can find it from our website. Also, the Genesis Academy, a collection of 12 DVDs, a wonderful teaching program that's great for Bible study groups. And there's a free study guide available for download. And of course, there's Creation magazine. Friends, I know many of you here today will already be subscribers to Creation magazine, but if you are not, I want to encourage you to get a hold of it. You see, this magazine is our #1 witnessing weapon. It's like our flagship publication. It's written for lay people. You don't have to be a scientist to understand it. And it has marvellous articles. A lot of the illustrations that you'll have seen on this weekend have come from Creation magazine. There's a children's section, and in this particular edition, it's on the solar system. You know, Creation magazine gives you answers to your own questions, encourages you in your faith. It enables you to answer your children's questions and your grandchildren's questions too. And it's a wonderful witnessing tool. We have so many testimonies of people whose lives have been changed because somebody gave them a Creation magazine. So I commend it to you. The psalmist said, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky displays his handiwork. Day after day it speaks out. Night after night it reveals his greatness." There is no actual speech or word, nor is its voice literally heard. Yet its voice echoes throughout the earth, its words carry to the distant horizon. You see, there is nowhere on this planet where you cannot look up and see the stars at night. And the stars speak of God's glory, and we give him his due when we acknowledge him as the Creator, and we are in awe of his majesty. As King David said in Psalm 8 that I shared at the beginning, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? The Son of Man that you care for him?" Friends, the God who spoke the universe into being who flung the stars to their most distant places, loves you so much that he sent his only Son for you. God waged a war with the enemy that cost him the life of his only Son. You know, believers are the trophies of that war, and I think the greatest expression of God's glory is those in whom he has placed his own Holy Spirit, regenerated by his love. So friends, our response to the heavens should be to give praise and thanks to our almighty Creator God. So truly, the light of the stars really do proclaim his glory. Thank you and God bless.